So the first presentation is by Professor Jane Stout, and Jane is Professor of Ecology at the School of Natural Sciences at Trinity and Vice President of Biodiversity and Climate Action. Jane, thanks.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to speak a little bit to give a bit of a context to what we're going to be discussing this morning. And really, when we talk about biodiversity on agricultural land, it's important to think about what it is we're talking about. So we're talking about all the different types of plants and animals and microorganisms that live on farmland, as well as the range of habitats that we find in the farm landscape. So the woodlands, the hedgerows, the grassy margins, the ditches, the stone walls, the rivers, the streams, all of this diversity, the species, the habitats, the woody plants in the woodlands and hedgerows, the wildflowers that pop up along on the verges, the birds, the bats, the bees, the beetles, and the other insects that make these habitats home, and of course the invertebrates, the worms, the bacteria, the fungi in the soils, as well as the aquatic creatures, so the fish, the invertebrates, the plankton that live in the rivers and streams. All of these different species, these different habitats is what we're talking about when we talk about farmland biodiversity. But as Helen said, as Carroll said actually, it's complex. And this complexity makes it actually quite hard to measure. And I suppose the first thing to say is our farming systems in general, globally, have become the opposite of biodiverse. So modern agriculture has resulted in the simplification of the structure of the environment and has really replaced nature's diversity with a small number of cultivated plants and animals, domesticated animals. So most of the food that we eat worldwide comes from just a handful of plant and animal species, and genetically, we're shockingly dependent on a very low number of varieties for major crops, so there's very little genetic diversity in these systems as well. Here in Ireland, 55% of our national land cover is grassland pastures for grazing, and just 3 plant species, perennial ryegrass, Italian ryegrass, and white clover, account for nearly all of the agricultural seed sold and planted in these grasslands. So we need to get biodiversity back into these landscapes, and we need this diversity, this variety of life in these farmed landscapes for many reasons. So from the farmer's point of view, crop diversity provides resilience in the face of change, whether that's, so growing different varieties can reduce vulnerability to things like weather events or disease. Diversity of wildlife, so insectivorous birds, bats, and other predatory invertebrates like beetles, wasps, and spiders can help keep potential insect pest populations under control. Diversity of pollinating insects, my specialist interest, can increase seed and fruit yields in entomophilous field crops and fruit crops. Diversity of life in the soil keeps the soil healthy, so invertebrates, fungi, and bacteria break down and recycle nutrients from dead material and dung. And the burial and the decomposition of dung prevents the buildup of pathogens, so this keeps grazing animals healthier. Fungal partners of plants in the soil allow atmospheric nutrients to be converted to a form that plants can actually use so that less fertilizer is needed. Diversity in our waterways keeps them clean, contributes to local hydrological processes, and diversity of habitats on farms contributes to maintaining microhabitats that are beneficial to farmers. For example, shelter for livestock. They can contribute to drainage, provide places for all this other wildlife to live. So there's lots of reasons why biodiversity on farms can have benefits for farmers, for farming systems. But of course, also biodiversity on farmland has much wider benefits and contributes much more broadly to society. So woody plants sequester and store carbon to contribute to global climate regulation. Farmland provides habitat for creatures that, even if they aren't necessary for production, they contribute to healthy functioning ecosystems. So for example, back to my pollinators, they might not be needed to pollinate crops, and in Ireland we grow very few pollinator-dependent crops. But they are needed for nearly all of our wild plant species. So 87% of wild plant species benefit from animal pollination. And those plant species themselves contribute to all these other things like reducing atmospheric carbon, providing food for other animals, regulating water flows, removing pollutants from soil, etc. And as well as that, diversity on farmland contributes to the aesthetic and cultural value of our landscapes, which is really important not only for our local communities, for health, for well-being, but also for recreation and for tourism. And biodiversity on farmland contributes to maintaining biodiversity at a national level. Because the current state of biodiversity on much of Irish land and agricultural land is not good. So 1/3 of species and nearly 90% of habitats that are protected under the European Nature Directives are in an unfavourable state. Many of our species are at risk of extinction. Most of our native plant species, so 56% of our native plant species have declined in range and or abundance, and native grassland plants have suffered the most, which seems odd when we think that Ireland is largely covered in grassland. But it's because that grassland is usually very highly managed to maintain a low number of species. And almost all most Irish bird species are also in decline, and it's the farmland birds like the curlew, lapwing, snipe, kestrel, skylark. It's this group that's seeing the most rapid deterioration. And these declines in biodiversity in Ireland are driven by similar processes of decline across the whole world, so loss of habitats, reduction in diversity of cropping systems, loss of traditional management approaches, so loss of things like hay meadows, replacement with silage cutting, and increases in agrochemical use. And the loss of farmland biodiversity has been recognised as a global issue. So it's been recognised in the Global Framework for Biodiversity, which has now been branded the Biodiversity Plan. So this is a global set of targets. And target 10 in the Global Biodiversity Plan is to enhance biodiversity and sustainability in agriculture, aquaculture, fisheries and forestry, and to increase the application of biodiversity-friendly practices. It's also recognised at EU level, and the Farm to Fork strategy aims to accelerate our transition to a sustainable food system that should reverse the loss of biodiversity. And the EU Biodiversity Strategy to 2030 states that at least 10% of agricultural area should be under high diversity landscape features. And our own National Biodiversity Plan that was launched earlier this year contains a lot of targets around delivering biodiversity on farmland, including ensuring that farmers are incentivised to create and maintain these biodiverse habitats on farms, targets around results-based payment schemes, the support of farming for nature to enhance ecological connectivity in the landscape, the development of measures and tools to maintain and enhance biodiversity and ecosystem services on high nature value farmland, and pollinator conservation on farmland through the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan. So there's a lot of interest globally, at the EU level, at national level. There's lots of targets and frameworks, but all of these things are only useful if they are implementable, if they're context specific and workable for the farmers who actually need to make a living. And to actually tackle global biodiversity loss, we can't just focus on farmland. We need to look at patterns of consumption. We need to look at whole food systems, including processing, policy, trade, and food waste. So not just production at the farm level. So this really requires a collaborative, transdisciplinary approach. It requires farmers working together at a local level, working with processors, working with researchers, policymakers, economists, other businesses, because there really is no silver bullet. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. And tailored approaches are needed with appropriate top-down policy and financial levers and appropriate bottom-up action from farmers and farming communities. So I will leave that there. Thank you.